Joining us now, the Harvard University lecturer Jessica Stern, who is the author of Denial, a Memoir of Terror, and she joins us on the line from Boston, Massachusetts. Jessica, I told you just before we went on tonight that I read your book and was absolutely, I guess the expression nowadays people use is gobsmacked. It is a stark, hard, difficult book to read. People know you about your books on terrorism, but this is about a personal moment of terror that took place when you were a teenager. Why don't you give our viewers a short sense about what this book's about?
Sure. I've been working on terrorism my whole career, and I never thought about the possibility that a brutal rape that I experienced when I was 15 years old might have led to my fascination with not just terrorism, but the terrorists, the people who kill others in the name of some idea. And I had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and I didn't believe the diagnosis, but I got curious about what had happened to me in 1973 when I was 15 years old, and I went to the police and asked them for the file, and they had to redact the file. It was in Concord, Massachusetts, a small town where crimes like this do not occur. And the officer who had to redact the file realized that a serial rapist of children could still be on the street. And he reopened the case and solved the crime. He was a serial rapist, it turns out. He raped or attacked at least 44 girls, probably many more, 20 of them within an 8-block area around Radcliffe, which is the women's school at Harvard.
Including you and your sister on that night back in the 1970s. And I got to tell you, you absolutely pull no punches in this book. It is so frank and so personal, and I wondered why you would want to write something that was that blunt, that personal, that traumatic.
Well, I didn't know how to do it other than doing it bluntly. I was exploring the impact of trauma, and I didn't know, to be honest, exactly what was important and what wasn't. So I just wrote down what the experience was like. As I investigated my rapist, I would go into altered states that are very common to people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wanted to capture that state on the page. You know, when soldiers come back from war, they can't go in and out of dissociation or flashbacks or nightmares. They can't control it, whereas I could do that. I could go and expose myself to triggers, write about what it felt like, write about the altered states I would go into, and then take a vacation. In my case, I would take a terrorism vacation. I would just call up my editor and say, I've had enough about this rape stuff, and I'm going to Saudi Arabia. Goodbye. I'll come back when I can go back to writing to you. But most people can't do that. I was revisiting an event that had occurred 35 years before, and I was really thinking about people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. I wanted to be able to describe that for others, because nobody ever described it to me.
The title of your book is Denial, as in you were in, your circle of friends and family were in this predicament of denial, the denial of the horror for a very, very long time. Why do you think denial of the events, of the impact, captured you and your circle for so many years?
Well, I think the town and the police operating at the time were in denial, partly because they didn't want to believe that this could happen in this idyllic town. They didn't believe my sister and me, my sister was with me, that a stranger had come into the house with a gun. They didn't want to believe that. They didn't want to think that other people could be at risk. It was just I think, kind of visceral animal reaction, which is not a very good one to indulge in if you're a police officer, because, of course, many other girls were raped, and the next victim after my sister and me killed herself. Why I was in denial, I think very much self-preservation. I did not want to be stuck in the past. I did not want to think of myself as a victim. And I don't think that my reaction was unique. I think that especially people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder do not want to believe that they have it. In my case, one of my reasons for disbelieving the therapist who diagnosed me was that I'm not a soldier. I thought PTSD was something veterans get. It turns out that the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder after rape is second only to torture. It's actually significantly higher, both for men and women, than is exposure to combat or getting shot at or attacked with a knife. I'm not sure why rape and torture are at the top of the list, but they are, and I think it may have something to do with shame. But there isn't really a consensus yet in the literature.
Here's the follow-up on the denial angle, though, and not only were you and your sister in denial, some of your friends at the time, the police department, the whole community. This shocked me when I read this. Your father, who was on business in Europe at the time, didn't believe it, and in fact didn't come home for, 4 days after getting the news? He wanted to hear the end of his conference before returning. I mean, that's a pretty serious sense of denial, isn't it?
I don't think it's exactly that he didn't believe it. I think he couldn't take it in. And what's happened since I wrote the book is many people have come to me to say that they were raped in the early 1970s or before, and the same kind of denial, both on the part of parents and the community and the police. In fact, I've also received letters from victims of the same rapist. And one woman told me that she was at university in Boston, and I know by looking at the list of the rapes that we have that she is a victim of the same man. And the school psychologist didn't believe her. And then once the psychologist believed her, said, well, didn't you partly enjoy it? I mean, this guy, in her case, stuck a gun up to her chin and cocked his gun, and she was sure he was killing her. Well, it turns out he was using a cap gun that looked very much like a real gun. And he always said, fooled you, cap gun. But that's a kind of, it's almost a kind of torture, and he seemed to be taunting the police. That was part of his modus operandi, and also taunting his victims by saying, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you if you don't do exactly what I say. And then at the end, admitting that it wasn't a real gun. But I think it's important to bear in mind that there are a lot of people out there who have suffered similar crimes or other traumas that result in post-traumatic stress disorder. And for them to read this kind of stark description of what it feels like to go into that altered state, I think is very helpful. That's what they're telling me. Nobody writes about this the way they do about some of the more romantic mental illnesses like depression or bipolar disorder. You can't read about it.
Let me follow up by asking about the guy at the center of all this, the serial rapist. You eventually found out who he was, and you eventually decided that you needed to know a lot more about him. And you cooperated with the police, and almost like you were a bit of a gumshoe yourself, you got out there and followed the trail of evidence so that you could learn more about him. Why did you feel the need to do that?
Well, that's just my character, I suppose. I am either cursed or blessed, I'm not sure, with insatiable curiosity. And I just really wanted to understand who this guy was. So initially, the police asked my help because they wanted to find out who the perpetrator was. Once we identified the perpetrator and once we discovered that he had killed himself several years before we had begun looking for him, the police were done. They didn't need to find him anymore. They didn't need to learn any more about him. But I wanted to learn about him, and I did learn a lot about him.
You learned a lot about him, but you did not get that moment where you get to, all those years later, face him down because, as you say, he was already dead. but I presume that you have in your mind wondered about what that moment would have been like. And have you thought about what you might have done had you ever had that confrontation?
Well, it would obviously be very hard. People who do terrible things like this have terrible lives, and it's, you know, by no means an excuse. I mean, he had terrible things happen to him. I believe he was abused by several priests, but one or more priests, and he was adopted and found out about that in the worst possible way. So in a way, I felt sorry for him, but most people who suffer that kind of trauma do not become violent. And I would have to live with both this sense of empathy and utter revulsion and condemnation. I'd have to be able to have both those feelings. Of course, I was fantasizing that once I looked at him, if he ever looked in my eye, it would just kill him, because he would see what he had done. Obviously, a fantasy.
Well, that is the obvious question. I mean, did you want to kill him? If you thought you had this confrontation with him still to come, would you have wanted to kill him?
Well, I'm pretty good at getting deep within to discover my innermost feelings. So yes, I will say that yes, but it doesn't mean that I would. I was hoping in my fantasy life that just looking at him would be enough. That would kill him.
Let's broaden the conversation here and talk about the thesis that you present towards the end of your book, a hypothesis on terrorism and terror and its link with humiliation. Explain that to us, if you would.
Well, I've been interviewing terrorists around the world for many years, and a theme, especially among Islamist terrorists, is that Islamic civilization has fallen behind intellectually, politically, financially, and that's a humiliating situation. It is true Islamic civilization was once the greatest civilization on earth and has fallen behind, but terrorists describe that situation as humiliating, terrorist leaders. And they, you know, humiliation's a feeling. You can help strengthen that feeling if you're a charismatic or cynical leader who thinks that a feeling of humiliation will work to your benefit. And I think that's exactly what Zawahiri and other terrorist leaders have thought. Zawahiri has said globalization is humiliating to Islam, and that the only way for Muslim youth to overcome this humiliation, to restore their dignity, is by getting involved in a violent jihad. It's a distortion of the notion of jihad, but that is what that idea that they've been able to spread. And frankly, I always suspected that there might be, in some cases, a more personal humiliation that was influencing the jihadis that I've met and talked to. But I didn't feel comfortable asking them about it. And I actually knew about something going on, which is the routine rape of young men at Pakistani madrasas, and now also in Afghanistan. And I know about this because it's widely covered in the Pakistani media. And now soldiers, our soldiers, are coming back from Afghanistan and describing what they see, that Afghan military and police commanders are themselves getting involved with rape of little boys. And our troops are exposed to this, and they won't talk about it. They talk to me about it. They talk to people they think would understand or who already know about it, but they won't talk to the media about it.
Well, here's an excerpt from a piece you did in Foreign Affairs magazine earlier this year on this very subject. You said, much has been written about the role of radical madrasas in creating terrorists in Pakistan and elsewhere. Outside of the Pakistani press, however, little note is made of the routine rape of boys at such schools. Also troubling is the rape of boys by warlords, the Afghan National Army, or the police in Afghanistan. Can you, I mean, clearly these are factors that go into creating terrorists. What other factors have you discovered along the way that contribute to someone becoming a terrorist?
Well, I tend to look at risk factors at different levels. At the global level, I would say globalization itself is in fact a risk factor. Global communications, the internet, just as they facilitate commerce, they also obviously facilitate terrorism. At the national level, military occupation is a key risk factor. High male to female ratios are a risk factor. Youth bulges are a risk factor. When you have a lot of boys in a society, that is correlated with an increased risk of terrorism and internal war. The youth bulge is correlated with inadequate education for women. Women who are more educated tend to have fewer kids. So even though education doesn't play a direct role, you can see that it could play an indirect role in reducing the risk of a youth bulge, which in turn is a risk factor for terrorism. At the personal level, terrorism, jihadi terrorism in particular, is a very glamorous profession, and it's a fad. And we see converts who are attracted to this faddish way to express a feeling of dissatisfaction with the status quo, rage at hegemonic powers, whatever they might be, and also the desire for an identity with dignity. And I do think that search for an identity with dignity is really key at the personal level, very much like what happens when kids join gangs.
But let me follow up on the sexual abuse angle, because the litany of the Catholic Church and the havoc wreaked by pedophile priests around the world has been well documented, but I can't think of a single instance where somebody from the Catholic Church who was abused by priests went on to become a terrorist. We also know from your work and others that you can't say the same thing about those who have been terrorized in the Islamic faith. What's different? I mean, it's a tough question to ask, but what's different about Islam which allows it to happen there, but apparently not in Catholicism?
Well, first of all, I don't think we can say that in Catholicism you don't see any terrorists. We don't see politically active terrorists. We don't see people acting in the name of some political idea.
That's a good distinction to make, because frankly, the guy who raped you was a terrorist of another sort. So yes, that's an important point to make. Thank you.
Most people who have been abused in this way do not become violent, as I said. It is absolutely not an excuse. But if you look at who ends up killing people, murdering, often they have some kind of history of abuse themselves. Why is it that Muslim terrorists are so much more successful at raising an army than their Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist counterparts, who are essentially flops as terrorists? Believe me, they try to do it, but they're not very successful today. I think that there are many factors, and they're related to the ones I mentioned earlier. There's military occupation is part of it. And there are all these different factors that are all interconnected, and you need lots of different risk factors. I mean, humiliation alone clearly isn't enough. Abuse alone isn't enough.
But if abuse is a part,
by no means.
If abuse is a part of the formula here, what kind of a solution potentially is out there to deal with that?
Well, this picture of Time magazine that showed the woman whose nose was cut off. I mean, obviously, we're not there to change in Afghanistan to change the culture, but at the same time, I think that there are some places that are so severely traumatized, where you have a whole society that really seems to be, there's such a high rate of PTSD, and I would say Gaza is probably another example, where it's a society that is so hurt, and where you really do have a risk of really, really bad behavior and the trauma getting passed on from one generation to the next. I'm not saying that this kind of trauma is the reason that we see terrorism in that part of the world. Not at all. I just think it's one of the issues that we need to look at and consider whether there's something we might be able to do, just perhaps by making it public. That's the beginning of it.
Now, after studying terrorists, more classically defined, for so many years, and being on the receiving end of a kind of terrorism yourself from your teenage years, can you answer this? Do you think there is always a reason why people do terrible things to other people?
In their own minds, there undoubtedly is. I guess I don't know enough about evil doers to answer that question definitively, but certainly the people that I've talked to who do evil things, from my perspective, they certainly have a reason. And not only that, it's easy to understand the moral logic that leads them to the conclusion that they should do evil things, even if we condemn what they're doing. When it comes to many of the terrorists that I've studied, I may condemn them out completely, their actions, but it doesn't mean that I can't understand or even empathize with the logic that they articulate.
But I guess what you're getting at there then is that you don't believe in the demon seed, if you like. Some people are just not born evil. There's a reason behind everything. Is that right?
I'm not really prepared to answer that question definitively. I mean, it could very well be that there are genetic risk factors as well that haven't been identified. I don't know, but it seems to me that we need to keep, when people commit crimes, they need to be held accountable, whether there is some kind of risk factor that they were born with or not. We can't have a society where we're always making excuses for people. At the same time, if we want to stop crimes, it's in our interest to try to understand all the different factors that lead people to get involved in criminal activity.
In which case, let me follow up on that. We know there are so-called terrorist rehabilitation programs out there that are supposed to deal with the personal, the psychological motivations of terrorists. How well, in your view, do those programs work?
Well, the biggest and most important experiment underway today is in Saudi Arabia, and I think the jury's still out. How well does the program work? I mean, it's hard to tease out whether, when terrorists are supposedly rehabilitated, what's the most important factor? Is it the surveillance, that they know that they're being monitored very closely, sometimes when they know, sometimes when they don't know? Is it the fact that the Saudi government gets them a wife if they don't have one? Is it that they're on medication? Clearly there have been some very important failures in the Saudi rehabilitation program, but if you look at how the programs that aim to prevent kids from joining gangs, police will tell you that it's much easier to stop a kid before he gets jumped into a gang, that prevention programs are more effective than rehabilitation programs. So I hope that the kind of prevention programs that we see underway now in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands will get further study. I mean, especially when we look at the kind of jihadi terrorism that's arising in the West. I think we do need to look at those prevention programs and see whether some might be applied, say, in Canada or in certain communities in the United States.
Finally, Jessica, in our last minute here, let me come full circle and return this to a more personal look. Do you think that your interest, fascination, use the word you prefer, with terrorism today, with violent men around the world today, stems in part because of the appalling, violent rape you were on the receiving end of when you were a teenager? Is there a connection there?
There is. I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but absolutely there is. And I think most of us, if we look inward, can figure out that there's a reason why we do what we do, even if what we're doing, we hope, is making the world a better place.
It's a stunning book, and Thank you for writing it, and I'm glad I read it. Jessica Stern, Harvard University, author of Denial, a Memoir of Terror. Thanks for being on the line there for us from Boston, Massachusetts tonight.
Thank you very much.